Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Professor Coleen T. Murphy. She's a professor of molecular biology at Princeton and also the director of Princeton's Specialist Lab for the Study of Aging. Her new book is How We Age, the Science of Longevity. We spoke about why women live longer than men all across the world, why eunuchs seem to live longer than other men, the role of sex hormones in aging, the gap between menopause and human life expectancy and what that tells us about humans compared with other animals. And in the extended part of the episode, we also spoke much more about the length of reproductive window and why women's reproductive window seems to be so small compared with men's, and whether we might be able to extend it with new research, and indeed all the other new research that's coming out, which might extend the human lifespan into potentially hundreds of years. That extended version of the episode can be found at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you will also find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Coleen, can we start by talking about differences between men and women in terms of longevity and health span? Because my understanding is that there's definitely something biological going on, but we do see some quite big gaps between male and female life expectancy across different countries, which you write about, which does suggest that it's not just biological. There must be social factors as well.
So what you're referring to is that in most countries, women live longer than men. So at least the life expectancy is longer. And we also know that all the centenarians, the longest lived humans are, for the most part, women. Something like the top, 10 oldest people in the world are women, and before the, oldest man comes up. So there's definitely something biological, but also it's been noted that life expectancies, of course, differ across the globe. And in different countries, that gap is either bigger or smaller. For example, in Japan, men do live a long time, so that gap is smaller. And then, not surprisingly, in places where there's a lot of military conflict, and which, has a disproportionately large impact on young men, so their life expectancy is lower. And then things like alcohol abuse has a really huge effect in some countries that also disproportionately affects men. So those things can be attributed to lifestyle and social effects, right? That have nothing to do with really like rate of aging or, the longest lived, the oldest part of lifespan. Sorry, mistakenly said that. Yeah. So, there are differences in that regard. There's also differences in what diseases arise with age. More women, possibly because they get older, they live to longer ages, they do end up with Alzheimer's at higher rates. But the question is, if you had all men live as long as women, would they also get it at the same rate? I think there's some work that's been done on that. I think that's not totally resolved. And then there are some regards where, there is actual biological difference because we have 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. And so for women, the way that our cells keep functioning healthily is that one of those X chromosomes is silenced, but that silencing tends to basically turn off with age. So then you have differences in X chromosomes. So Dina DeBall at UCSF has done a lot of work on trying to understand how that lack of X chromosome silencing that arises with age, how that affects animal lifespan, and particularly cognitive function. And so there are differences, and people are trying to understand now where those differences come from at the biological level, in addition to what we already know from differences in, social effects that we see.
So is the idea that it might be advantageous for women as they get older to have less silencing of the other X chromosome, because if you have some problem with a gene on the first chromosome, you have a sort of backup available? Is that
certainly in some cases that might be the case, but it might become a problem in some cases. So that's what Dina's group is trying to work out, is which of these things are advantageous and which things are actually detrimental. And in both scenarios, you can imagine that, like, understanding that better, where you could basically like inhibit one gene if it's bad, if it is not silenced anymore, or trying to activate more of it, even in men, might be helpful depending on what the real underlying molecular mechanism is. So yeah, understanding at the molecular is really critical, because we don't know at the outset which things are actually better or worse.
Just thinking again about this historical pattern of women living longer than men, is this relatively recent as a phenomenon because maternal mortality has fallen so much, at least in developed parts of the world?
That's a great question. There's probably someone who would be better equipped to answer that question, like the historical point, because people are all living longer. Maternal mortality has dropped. Unfortunately, in the United States, it's not as dropped as much as we would hope. And actually, that's also very dependent on ethnic groups, not just because of biology, actually, a lot because of the disparities in the healthcare system that impact, for example, Black women and Hispanic women more. And so some of these are difficult to disentangle, right? You have to have, like healthcare in different countries, you see different things. But that's a great question. Like, are women living longer simply because they survive?
There's this one pinch point, and if you get past
it,
if
you get past it, you'll live longer. And certainly there's a lot to be said for that. I just don't know proportionally. I don't know what the rates used to be. So you'd have to look over a historical perspective. And I don't currently have those data.
But then it's very interesting, as you note, that at the very, very extreme tail, you have these super long-lived people are really disproportionately women. So that does suggest that something going. And am I right that once you get to that really extreme end where you're living, 110 or longer, that seems to be very genetic, that those people are not necessarily super clean living.
Oh, I would say even before that
and so on.
Yeah, people are centenarians in general. Like, if you read any of their personal accounts of when they are always asked, like, how did you live so long? And almost all of them talk about, like, having a shot of whiskey every day or something like that.
Yes.
That is very counterintuitive. And I think that's because, to some degree, it didn't matter how they lived, because they were, and in fact, actually, some of the most interesting data are that sometimes when people have looked at the genomes of the people who are centenarians, it turns out that they still have a lot of the really bad alleles for different diseases. They just happen to have, because of, whatever longevity gene that they did, get lucky enough to have a mutation in, they've sort of overcome those or avoided those diseases. So I think that's I think the biggest message we can learn from them is those genes are super powerful and may, like, override everything else. And that's something we can learn from, not to, like, it doesn't help us with lifestyle choices at all. What it helps us with is understanding what are the molecular pathways that we should really target if we want to get to usable interventions.
There's something magic going on in there, if we could work out what it was. Yeah. Do they tend to have longer health spans as well, centenarians?
Yeah. So there's really nice work from Nira Barzilai where they ask that question, because I think one of our biggest fears is, if we extend lifespan, are we going to just stretch out the period of time when we're unhealthy? And so Nir's group asked that question head on. They looked at centenarians and non-centenarians, and they could see that, and then the onset of different age-related diseases. And what they saw was that the people who lived much longer actually, it seems logical when you say it and not surprising, but in fact, they actually staved off those age-related diseases much longer than anyone else. And so that tells us what they've done is they've actually, what's called compression of morbidity, they have actually managed to, like, shift, that, like, really aged, unhealthy part of life until the very end. and possibly even compressed it so that they only experience a few years of truly bad health. It's like kind of what we'd all like to have, right?
It seems to me, just thinking again about this sort of historical demography, that in a country like the UK, which obviously I know better, we have got pretty good at extending lifespan. And obviously the 20th century is this miraculous century in terms of how many years we added to lifespan in not just in developed countries, but everywhere. But we haven't got great necessarily at expanding health span. And we have, and it was one of the things that became apparent from COVID, just what a large population we have of quite frail elderly people, many living in care homes, but many not, and that period of frailty can be really long for a lot of people. And it seems as if medical science isn't as good at that bit. Right? Medical science is good at stopping you from dying, but not that great at making you really healthy.
And I think part of that is, if we think about why people are living so long, how did they get to that age? Our increase in life expectancy hasn't been largely, to this point, hasn't been because of the work that, labs like mine have done on extended longevity. It's been because we've done a great job, and this was, decades ago, of increasing, decreasing infant mortality, increasing survival through childhood through things like vaccines, which, people forget. Kids died all the time of measles, people got polio. Like, vaccines are super important. And I worry that people are not taking that message seriously enough. So we helped kids live long enough. There were these dips, right? Like during World War I and World War II and the 1918 flu, right? So once people got past those, then they were able to live much longer. And we have done a good job in one area, which was really, I think, heart disease. That's actually one of the big successes in medical science, where people are able to take drugs that help them live longer, to address cardiovascular disorders and stroke, for example, and statins. So that is one area where people are living longer because they're taking those drugs every day.
But presumably that's having to kind of try and outpace the lifestyle stuff as well, because we've got rising obesity. So the heart disease interventions are maybe just keeping us steady.
Well, that is possible. It's hard to know because then people were already living longer. So what's outpacing another? But there are definitely people who genetically were going to have problems. Like, lots of people had a, parent who died of a heart attack at 42. And that wasn't a lifestyle problem. That was actually because they have, so those people who know that, they're able to take drugs now that will help them live longer. So that is not a lifestyle intervention. That's actually because of medicine. So that's a one area where I think we're getting much better. But again, people live to a long, rather advanced age because they got through those like pinch points in early like childhood and adolescence that used to be the, real problems. And now they're getting to the age where we have to start intervening using some of this longevity medicine that's on the horizon. It's just not there yet, right? We're not to the point where we are prescribing drugs specifically to help people live longer.
Okay, so yes, you mentioned the fact that it's really infant mortality and child mortality that drags down life expectancy in most historical periods, and that it leads to this misconception that people are all reliably dropping dead in their 30s and 40s just because life expectancy is in the 30s and 40s for a particular period of time. Not true. There are always some people who lived really quite a long time. Were there historically, though, people who lived, obviously you read in the Bible or whatever about people who've lived a really long time, but things like the people now who are living, the centenarians, did they exist before we had some of the modern stuff we have now, like sanitation and vaccines and all this good stuff?
That's a great question. And again, since I'm not a historian, I'm not going to delve too deeply, but I think the problem really is knowing, having reliable medical birth records to know that, right? So I think that only started probably in the mid 1800s for most people. So I'm not sure we would know. I mean, there are always going to be outliers, but my guess is that they would have been like 105 at most or something. Whereas now you have a lot of people who are living to be 115. And so what's that do to like those types of improvements? I forgot to mention sanitation and public health. Absolutely. That's, yeah. People having surgery, antibiotics, right? Like all these things where like, we are able to get people through those early stages of death, but early stages of life so that they don't die. Super important, but not really not due to anything about longevity. Yeah, so historically, there's always stories, but I think just people didn't keep good track. And if you go to certain parts of the world now, they'll introduce you to someone who they say is 105 years old, but there's no
You write about this
record.
funny story of the French woman who's possibly the oldest living person ever, who, what, 122, but maybe actually her daughter swapped identities for some tax evasion reason, right?
That was a controversy that arose a few years ago, and it really makes some people mad to even bring it up. I just find it kind of amusing, and the thing is, it doesn't undermine all the work on centenarians or anything, because there's other people who lived almost that long, right? At least two other people lived to be 119, two other women. So, I like whether it was true or not is kind of less important than the fact that it is possible that there's like other people who could have probably lived maybe that long. We just didn't know about it.
Which suggests that there's this theory, isn't there, that there's 115 is the kind of hard cutoff, but there are a handful of people who've lived beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a hard cutoff. I think if you delve into the statistics, that paper was not good. Demographers have essentially destroyed the statistical analysis that was done on that paper, and I do write about that in the book. And it's kind of a weird thing to say too, because we know people who are older than 115. There can't possibly be a hard cutoff. It's just that fewer and fewer people make it to that point. Um, yeah. So it was actually kind of funny watching that whole story unfold, because it was one of the things that you kind of think, well, maybe this probably might not have been a paper in Nature if people weren't so interested in it, because it really wasn't. Like, demographers came in and at least 5 different groups showed why that was not done correctly. But it made it into the popular press, like that 115 is like as old as you can be. So a little bit painful as a scientist to like read that. Say like, okay. Anyway, I would recommend reading that little section there, because there there were great analyses that were done, and almost in a very amusing way, how they described how that wasn't possible. Basically, you have more and more people who live older and older, and that's just going to continue to happen. Just at probably lower frequency than, like, I think the problem really was that 122-year-old point really skewed things. So it's really important. I mean, I used to not think it was important to figure out like why that was, but like it really skewed that curve. And so if you take that point away, people are living longer and longer and longer. There's just no, eventually there's going to be several people who lived be over 120. We just are going to keep better track of them.
And these are people, right, who have not had any kind of novel medical interventions, because obviously these are people who were born in the early 19th century at latest. So they didn't actually grow up with great sanitation,
No.
or vaccines or any of this stuff. Well, some vaccines, but nothing like what we have now. Yeah.
But certainly none of the things. So in a lot of ways, they got lucky, right? They didn't die in the 1918 flu. They didn't, get into a war. They didn't have an accident. So there's a lot of things that can have nothing to do with medicine or genetics, getting lucky over and over again, plus the genetics that allow you to really like stave off these age-related diseases. And I think that part is very true. None of those people died of a cancer, right? Which is pretty remarkable. So yeah, they got lucky over and over again.
Just going back to this question about what we have got better at in terms of medical science extending longevity, have we got better at treating cancer? Because I thought something like breast cancer, for instance, is now, we have many more treatments than we did even relatively recently.
For specific kinds of cancers, we're much better, right? Actually, one of the most remarkable stories is there were cases of melanoma that people just were not treatable. And now these new CAR T therapies, they're actually really great. So there are specific kinds of cancer where they've gone from really like a death sentence to definitely you can survive them. And then we have others that we still, glioblastoma, that is not great. And pancreatic cancer. I think those are the two big ones where that's been sort of incremental, and probably it would be great if someone could finally figure out how to treat those. So just every cancer type is different. And so we can't say we've gotten rid of all cancer. We've gotten better in general, and specific ones are greatly, much better treated now. And so hopefully there'll be something on the horizon soon for those really, really deadly cancers. And then of course, childhood cancers. One thing that's come up that I've been really interested in lately is that, there's this issue of people who have survived cancers in childhood. They later experience age-related diseases much earlier. And so, yeah. And so one of the things I was really encouraged to hear was this idea of using drugs that were developed really for longevity, like senolytics, to treat those patients. And that's, I think, is a great side effect, basically, of trying to study aging. You may not be that interested in extending lifespan, but if you can help people who have had some other problem so that they live their maximum lifespan, that would be great, right? So I really like that people are thinking about how to use these drugs in that way.
Do we know whether it's the cancer itself or the treatment or some third factor that might lead to this premature aging?
I don't know a lot about that. My impression was it was due to things like chemotherapies that can, because you have to, in order to kill cancer cells, it's pretty hard on the rest of the body. And so that was my impression, but I'm certainly not an expert in that area.
While we're still talking about the very elderly, that end of life, can we talk about the grandmother hypothesis? This is so interesting, and particularly about how it relates to us having an unusually early, well, not necessarily unusually early menopause, but an unusually long, most postmenopausal life compared with other animals.
The grandmother hypothesis is interesting because, and so I think probably the listeners know this, but this is the idea that women live so long, partly because it is evolutionarily advantageous to help with your grand progeny, right? So that's more of a sociological observation. It's not a biological observation. And what's been noted recently in mammals is that, there are some sea living mammals, right, like whales, that seem to also experience this. And so you can imagine mammals, they're really invested in the care of their young and maybe even their grand progeny. However, years ago, my lab found out that even C. elegans has an extremely long post-reproductive lifespan, and they definitely don't care for their young. And so then it
brings up the question, to interrupt, C. elegans is a worm, is that right?
C. elegans, yeah. C. elegans is a little worm. Yeah. C. elegans is a little worm. It's like a millimeter long. It looks like lint if you look at it on the plate. And that's the model system that we use to study aging and age-related diseases and reproductive aging and cognitive aging in my own lab. And so we had this observation that the worms will start, they'll stop reproducing at about day 5 of adulthood, but they'll live another 2 weeks. And so why did they do that? And so then we started wondering about that, and we carried out a series of studies. I had an undergraduate in the lab. So at Princeton, the undergraduates have to do a senior thesis. And I had this student, George, he looked through, basically like through records of all kinds of animals to find out what is the reproductive span and the lifespan of all these different animals. And what does it correlate with? Now with mammals, it's all, pretty much in this one tight box that the reproductive span and that is proportional to lifespan and that all look the same. But what got really interesting when you look outside of mammals, that it all correlates with the size of the progeny. Okay, so the idea here is that, if we take C. elegans as the example, this is a worm and the eggs are kind of huge compared to the rest of the body. So in order for that mother worm to survive laying that egg, she has to be in pretty good shape. And it actually is not too different from the fact that, our babies' heads have evolved to be about as big as they can be without killing all of us, the mothers, as we give birth. And so that turns out to scale with all kinds of different animals, roughly. So the size of the progeny, the bigger the progeny, the bigger the post-reproductive lifespan across all kinds of organisms. And the extreme is at one end, like you have like a sea urchin, which is like maybe like soccer ball size, and they have microscopic progeny, and they reproduce up until like that can be decades, until the day they die. Like they'll die the next day. So they have a very short post-reproductive lifespan, and all of us mammals are at the other end. We have very long.
So just to be clear, this isn't the absolute size of the progeny. This is the size relative to the mother of the progeny.
That's right. So the size relative to and that's how we scaled it. Yeah. So the smaller the progeny and the easier it is to get out, the less, physical health they need. And this is true across all kinds of organisms, which is really surprising. It gets you away from I think for humans, there's on top of that, the sociological bit of So what we haven't untangled is what fraction in humans is due to the biological part and what fraction is due to this sociological input, like the help of the grandmothers to their grand progeny.
Interesting. If it were just to do with grandmothers assisting with childcare, then we would expect there to be we would expect men to live even less long than women.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's the question. Like, why is it even on the same scale? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
maybe it's that extra boost.
Right. So it might actually, okay, interesting. So it's more that we're at the very end of the spectrum in terms of our young being particularly big relative to the size of the mothers.
It's one hypothesis. We just, we did this correlation, and correlation is not causation, of course, but it was interesting to see this, that it like was, because within mammals, you could see kind of the same thing, but they're like all the mammals, like when we did this big scale, are kind of all in the same box. So, whereas, you go across all kinds of organisms and you scale it the same way. Anyway, it was just kind of a fun experiment to do because we never really thought about that. But like once we saw that worms live so long after they're done reproducing, it kind of made us wonder because, we don't think they cared for their young at all.
I have read data, I can't think of the numbers off the top of my head now, but when maternal grandmothers are alive, their grandchildren are more likely to survive in obviously in harsher sort of Darwinian conditions than ours. So there probably is some maternal care.
Absolutely. I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying like the biological part of that actually exists outside of it. So yeah.
Okay, thinking more about menopause, we also have a pretty big gap between the point at which female fertility starts to wane and when actual menopause happens. What's going on there?
Actually, I'm glad that you said that because, so I'll just say when I started my lab, I got really interested in this idea of extending reproductive span or understanding reproductive aging because of that sort of question, or more because, if I could have lived 150, I'd still have to have all my kids by, latest early 40s, right? And so that was heavy on my mind at the time. And so I would start studying this in C. elegans because we wanted to know, is there anything that we can do to extend reproductive span? Is that shared? But what I want to say, I was talking about the work, the results that we had at a meeting once, and this guy kept asking me a question. I was so confused because he kept using menopause and fertility, like end of fertility, interchangeably. And we women all know those are not the same, like 10 or 15-year gap. So but it's so prevalent in the scientific literature that people use those terms interchangeably, or at least they did outside of humans, that I couldn't even understand what the guy was asking. And later on, I realized he was using menopause to mean like reproductive aging. And so yeah, there's a 15-year gap there. So if you're interested in understanding like oocyte quality decline, which is the rate limiting factor for fertility, that's something that we start to get really concerned about in like mid 30s up through 40s, right? Menopause, which in the United States, I don't know for Britain, but probably similar. Menopause, the average onset in the United States is around 51. Right. And so like a different 35 to 51, huge gap. And then there's all these issues with perimenopause and of course, menopause. One of the most eye-opening studies I read was a kind of interesting clock paper done by Morgan Levine and Stephen Horvath. And they were using this DNA methylation clock to try to analyze how the rate of aging. And what they saw was that women post-menopause had this huge increase in the rate of aging, which is very concerning. But they could really see that in their clock data. And I think that's just now this idea that we should study menopause and separate from fertility. Those are interesting, both important questions. They're two different ones, and their effects, especially menopause's effect on aging, that's becoming a now real research area that's finally getting some financial support funding. And so I think we're going to make some breakthroughs soon, but it's an area that definitely needs more funding support.
Yeah, sex hormones have this slightly interesting, slightly mysterious effect on aging, right? Because yes, as you say, there's something about the postmenopausal, I guess, hormonal environment, which is accelerating aging for women. But then also testosterone seems to be bad for men's health. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's good and bad. So yeah, right. So for women, yeah, like loss of estrogen post menopause is bad, and that seems. But we have to, it's tricky. You have to get the hormone levels right because you want to also not have such high levels that you induce certain forms of cancer that are associated with high levels of estrogen. But I think that's been now better worked out. Better than the HRT hormone replacement therapies that were done many years ago. So I think that has been actually. So that's a bright spot, I think, in women's health. That hormone replacement therapy is probably one of the better studied areas. Testosterone, that's tricky. So, yeah, I think a lot of men try to take extra testosterone. The people are because it, helps bulk them up and makes them feel younger. The long-term effects are probably bad as far as longevity goes. So it's not one thing that I would recommend, even though I'm sure that it probably feels great to those guys who can finally like lift a lot of weights and they're feeling more vibrant and stuff. So um, I think that's probably something where they really should work more closely with their doctors. And I assume that many of them are not working with doctors to get that extra testosterone.
So you write about this amazing study of eunuchs, right? That was it Korean eunuchs, is that right? Who had this incredibly extended lifespan compared with other men.
Yeah, so that was a study that came out many years ago. It was much debated, and I tried to make sure that I cited those concerns as well. But it was just an observation, sort of historical observation that, and it was a small number of men, which is why the statistics are a little wonky. But those eunuchs actually lived much longer. So to be we talk about the human studies because that's what we care about, but of course, the really well-controlled studies have all been done in model systems. And we do know that, for example, you know, losing the germline of an animal extends their lifespan. But it makes sense. So if we put this in context of the only reason that we have any pathways that regulate longevity is not for longevity purpose, right? Because that's not evolutionarily selected at all. The reason we have these longevity pathways is because every animal is trying to, basically, if you think in evolutionary terms, they're trying to replace themselves. They're trying to put out more of their genome, right? So regulating their response to conditions is super important. So if you have an animal that doesn't have much food, it doesn't make sense to have a lot of progeny, right, that are then going to be released into a low food environment and starve to death. What makes sense to do is to then dial back all of your metabolism, slow everything down, and then maybe there's going to be another day where there's more food and you can dial everything back up and the germline can continue and reproduction can continue. The way that you make sure that the body is still healthy enough to have those progeny, reproduce, is to slow down all these somatic mechanisms, and that's what we consider longevity pathways, right? So those are all coordinated. So the reproductive system is coordinated with the rest of the body in order to optimize reproduction under very different conditions. So they're adapting to that. So, that's where certainly the model systems that we've studied, there's huge effects of ablating the germline or the gonad. Ablating the germline, for example, in C. elegans can double lifespan. But if you ablate the gonad, the somatic gonad that supports the germline, that effect goes away because there's these competing systems that all tell each other, I do have enough nutrients or I don't have enough nutrients. And so, yeah, everything's kind of tied together by reproduction affecting lifespan, which is hard for us as humans to think about because when we think about aging, we think about like somebody who's really very post-reproductive, right? So I know that's a long-winded answer, but that's how the germline, like the reproductive system is extremely important for the context of thinking about longevity pathways.
Okay, so this is potentially confusing as a statistic, but let's unpack it, right? That women who have children in their 40s are more likely to become centenarians by like a factor of 4 or something like that. And this is also this was historical data from the 19th century. So we're not looking at people who, it's unlikely to be socioeconomic. So like now, obviously, older mothers are more likely to be wealthier. That's not true, as far as I know, in the 19th century. So that does seem to be probably something biological. That doesn't mean, though, you should have kids in your 40s in order to live to 100, right?
The way to think of that study, which I love, by the way, that's such a cool observation because Tom Perls took women who had been centenarians. I think in one group looked at women who lived to be the age of 95, and then when did they have their last child? And in that case, and it more importantly than like not socioeconomic factors, more importantly, I think is that which it might have still been because you had to be like relatively, well off to have kids and survive. Anyway, there were no artificial reproductive technologies, right? So having a kid that late wasn't because someone was doing IVF. It was because they were just naturally able to have a kid at that age. And so what that tells us is that having a child late was more of a biomarker of future longevity. And so, yeah, it was funny when that paper came out, there were newspaper headlines saying, actually the wrong thing, it said something like having a kid late makes you live long, which is exactly the wrong interpretation. It was more that having a kid late is a biomarker, a sign that you're healthy enough, exactly, or you're like genetically probably destined to be healthy enough to live a long time.
Because reproduction is a very complicated process, and which means that subfertility or infertility can be a bit of a canary in the coal mine. Like there's other health problems going on, which is evident in this way. And so if you're super fertile still in your 40s, that suggests that everything's
still
going
working.
well.
And also at a systemic level, like the whole body, not just the reproductive system, right? So that things are just still working in a sign of youth.
Yeah. What's the other? But then I think you also say that having lots of children shortens a woman's life.
It's not me saying that. It's
that's what the numbers say. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the sweet spot?
2 kids.
Okay.
There's a very steep, like one of the papers that we study in my class has like what's called parity. So number of children, and there's like definitely a peak at 2 and goes down after that.
Right. And do we know if that's biological or social or both?
Oh gosh, no. Yeah, I don't know. That there was just like an observation, right? So I think there was no way from that kind of study to address the cause. It's just an observation, yeah.
Okay, so no one should listen to this podcast and go off and make their reproductive decisions based on
I don't think so.
being desperate to become a centenarian. I don't know if that many people want to become centenarians, which is, I guess, partly because of what we spoke about earlier, this fear of just extending lifespan without extending health span seems like a really horrible prospect.
Most of the things that we're thinking about that would effectively make you a centenarian will make you live a healthier life. So they are connected. I think it's just that I think what we're seeing now in modern society also is like a lot of metabolic disease. And so that's not affecting centenarians. That's affecting people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, right? So that's not a centenarian issue. That's like a late middle life kind of issue. But I don't think you should make. Yeah, I think that it's probably an unhealthy strategy in general, just to like live your life in order to live a long time. That's why I'm so against caloric restriction. I just can't imagine spending my whole life doing caloric restriction in order to live a long time. That's not I find that just like completely unpleasant. So, but there's some people who love that idea. There's some people who love that idea. Some people are doing intermittent fasting. There's people doing time restricted. They're really obsessed with what and when they eat, I think, in order to live a long time. And I think, if they feel better, that's great. But if that's the only goal, then I think there's much better things to do with your time.
Well, so I suppose intermittent fasting is different because you're still potentially having your sort of maintenance calories. The other kinds of restriction where you deliberately have fewer calories than your body needs, does that actually extend lifespan?
Okay, so in all model systems, it does.
By how much?
Yeah, well, you have to lower your intake by 30% at least. It's a lot. And then it extends your lifespan by like 30% in a model system, not in your like human. Okay. But that's why I love these DAF2 mutants and C. elegans. This is the insulin receptor mutant. Those double lifespan. They eat whatever they want. Right? You'd rather be a DAF2 worm than calorically restrict. So I think, and the other thing to keep in mind is that there was a really nice paper by, I think his name is Ethan Weiss at UCSF, and they actually were studying time restricted eating, so kind of intermittent fasting. And when they looked at the control group, they found that those people also had it basically the same effect. And the only thing that they were doing was just keeping track of what they ate when they ate it. But they didn't have any restrictions. And so I think that tells us more that some of these things may not have anything to do with when or what we eat, but this keeping track makes us sort of naturally more aware of it. And I will tell you, every organism that's given a choice, like if you caloric restrict them and then you present them with the food, they will go eat the food. So it's not like they love it. It's just, in the lab, people force them to do that. So the caloric restriction stuff, I think I'd rather, the reason we study it, a lot of us, is because we want to know what are the molecular pathways that work, and is there an intervention, some sort of therapeutic where you could hit that, and like people would still get to eat, but they would benefit from like effectively being caloric restriction. I think that's an interesting question.
And we'd have fewer trade-offs as well, because I presume if you're going to get really skinny, you're not going to be able to do things as easily like resistance training, so you risk osteoporosis. Like there must be some really significant trade-offs, not just in terms of being miserable.
Yeah, I mean the problem is when you ask people who are doing this, they're such ardent evangelists about this that they really won't admit to that. But there is in that study that Ethan Weiss's lab did, I think that they found that there was actually loss of muscle. And I don't know, you don't want to lose muscle. You don't want to become weak. Yeah. I would say, like, for all these things, that when people ask me what we can do right now, I think, yes, maybe eating a little bit less, but not being like crazy about it, but really doing exercise. And it seems like it's interesting because what you mentioned, like resistance training. So it seems that, doing weightlifting, those kinds of exercises might be better in the long run than just cardio. And that for those reasons of keeping your muscles healthy, and muscles are hugely important for maintaining the rest of your body's health.
In terms of the things, the lifestyle changes that we can make that make us more likely to be healthy for longer and live longer, they are generally obvious ones, right? So it's eat reasonably, exercise, all the stuff that people are doing in these blue zones, right? These parts of the world where people live much longer for some reason. Well, we kind of know the reasons, right? And they're sort of obvious and a bit boring.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason people are interested in this topic is they want someone like me to tell them something they've never heard before as far as what they should do differently. I think in a couple of years that will happen, right? There'll be some drugs that actually make people live longer that don't involve all the hard things that we have to do now just to like stay healthy, right?
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.